Thank you for joining our session, your 2022 Compass for Commercializing, Manufacturing, and Marketing Cell and Gene Therapies. I'm Mike Druckman, a partner in the life sciences practice of the global law firm Hogan Lovells. I'm really happy today to have colleagues of mine from 4 different continents to discuss current legal and regulatory issues facing those developing and marketing regenerative medicines. These medicines, called advanced therapy medicinal products in Europe, include a wide range of products, such as cellular, tissue, and gene therapies. As you undoubtedly know, since you're here at this conference, these therapies are transforming medicine and saving and improving the lives of patients around the world. They also raise a huge number of legal and regulatory issues. These products range in complexity and uses, all the way from very complicated products like Novartis' Zolgensma for curing spinal muscular atrophy in infants, all the way to more simple products, but still very important, like amniotic wound covers. The number of issues raised around the world in different countries are also very diverse and require some careful planning to make sure that you, as you're developing and working with these products, can optimize their value to patients and to the community. So to elaborate on these issues, we will first have each of my colleagues briefly introduce themselves and then talk about some of the key issues that they are seeing briefly at the high level in their jurisdictions. And then we'll we'll move to discussing 3 different high-level topics that touch many of these jurisdictions to see how they play out in the particular countries. So with that, I'm pleased to turn the baton to my partner, Mandy Jacobson in Australia.
Thanks, Mike, for that lovely introduction. It is a pleasure to join you in this fabulous panel of guests. My name is Mandy Jacobson. I head up Life Sciences at Hogan Lovells, Australia. I'm situated in Sydney. I focus on regulatory and compliance work, clinical trial, product liability, privacy, as well as dispute resolution. And I will now hand over to my partner, Lu Zhao.
Thanks, Mandy. Hi, everyone. Hi, my name is Lu Zhou. I'm a corporate partner based in Beijing, China. My practice focuses on corporate transactional matters representing life sciences and healthcare clients in cross-border M&A and license transactions. Fortunately, throughout my transactional practice, our life sciences clients entrust me with regulatory matters from time to time in respect of their China market entry, clinical trial, and other post-market compliance issues as well. So China market grows really fast in this industry. With a large population in China, the regulatory authorities have the goal of facilitating expedited process of making the advanced drugs, devices, and also therapeutical technologies available in China. On the other hand, authority also focuses more and more on the post-market inspections and supervisions to ensure the safety of the products in terms of human life, as well as the data privacy and the human genetic resources matters to be well practiced in China. So Chinese authorities definitely moving towards the direction to be more consistent with the international practice, but they have their own focus of attention. For example, human genetic resources is subject to very restrictive limitations in China as for the usage or cross-border transfer activities. So we closely follow the constant promulgation of those new regulations, practical guidelines, and also communicate with the authority day-to-day basis to support our clients' success in China. Now I will pass this along to our Beijing colleague, Carol Shaw, to introduce a bit more about her practice. Carol, please.
Okay, thank you, Lu. Hi, everyone. My name is Carol Xiao. I'm an associate based in Beijing, China, and my practice focused on the life science matters. In detail, I have helped the clients in providing the regulatory and compliance advice of drugs and medical devices on their full life cycles in China, from the preclinical study, clinical trial, product registration, manufacturing, distribution, even to the post-marketing studies. And for clinical trial, we help the clients to review the clinical trial protocol, the patient-informed consent, also provide the advice on issues that need attention in the clinical trial process according to the China GCP. And for the product registration, we help the client to determine the product classification and provide the advice of registration procedures and review the application documents. And for the product distribution, we help clients to obtain the distribution license with the authority and also open their online distribution stores in China, and help the client to review their advertising materials and promotion documents. In addition, we also help conduct certain transactional due diligence for the life science client and provided the regulatory advice of sales representative from the FCPA perspective. And we participated the internal FCPA investigation of certain pharmaceutical companies as well. And let me pass to the next speaker, Michael.
Many thanks, Carol. So my name is Michael Salmela, and I'm a partner of Hogan Lovells based in Paris, France. My practice focuses on regulatory, compliance, and transactional work in the life sciences space with a number of projects involving regenerative medicine. My team has been in particular working hard on the launch of CAR-T products and more generally on gene therapies in Europe. So we assist both development stage companies and larger pharma groups on how they enter the European markets, the regulatory constraints that they need to bear in mind, both in relation to R&D and commercial aspects, and also supporting on a variety of commercial agreements that they put in place in this context. So these are really exciting times for this industry in Europe. The European Commission had adopted in 2020 a pharmaceutical strategy for Europe, and one of its pillars is supporting competitiveness and innovation. And cell-based and gene therapy products are an important part of this strategy. And on our local level, from a French standpoint, the French government has recently announced a plan to invest massive amounts in biotherapies and biomanufacturing. And the objective is to make France an international leader in biotherapies and biomanufacturing. And this aims at supporting the development of new biotherapies so that we're no longer as dependent on foreign biotherapies. So this is all looking very promising, but the industry is, however, voicing some concerns on the EU regulatory frameworks. Clinical trials, infrastructure, health technology assessments, among other things, are not sufficiently adapted to respond to the industry's needs. Market access is also a major concern, which leads me to let my partner, Charlotte Damiano, who is one of the proficient known experts in this field, to introduce herself. So go ahead, Charlotte.
Thank you, Michael. As Michael was saying, I'm a partner in the life science department in the Paris office with Michael, and my practice focuses on market access. And I intervene at different stages of market access. At the very early stage, post-approval and pre-reimbursement in negotiating early access programs that you may know is a French-specific regime with a derogatory financing, recently amended in France, especially for innovative products. Second, I intervene also before the reimbursement approval in preparing the health technology assessment, which is leading the pricing level. And finally, during the reimbursement process in negotiating the reimbursement condition and the pricing condition, including the list price and the clawbacks that we have to pay in France to the government. We have been working on market access for gene therapy since the first CAR-Ts in lymphoma and leukemia introduction in France on the French market, and we continue to support these products and also work on market access for new products in development, CAR-Ts and other immunotherapies. And I will let my partner Lowell introduce himself.
Thanks. Good morning. I'm Lowell Zeta, a partner in the pharma biotech group at Hogan Lovells in the Washington, D.C. office. And I work closely with developers from innovative startups, academic institutions to multinational biopharma companies to develop, obtain FDA approval, and scale up innovative medicines to reach patients, and including especially cell and gene therapies aimed to treat serious and life-threatening diseases. And my perspective is from my time at Hogan Lovells, as well as my time at FDA, where I served as senior counselor to the then FDA commissioner and focused on promoting innovation of cutting-edge technologies. And one of those strategic priorities was innovation in cell and gene therapy development. A core focus of my practice at Hogan Lovells is product quality, manufacturing, and compliance. And we know that high quality manufacturing is a key element for success in cell and gene therapy growth and innovation, and that high costs, slow turnaround, and unknown sources of variability can be a real challenge. I also help innovators with thinking about their clinical endpoints and how they're measured. So for example, through companion diagnostics and validation approaches for digital tools integrated into drug development programs. I'll now pass it on to my colleague, James.
Thanks, Lowell. My name is James Huang. I'm a counsel in the healthcare practice at Hogan Lovells in Washington, D.C. And my practice focuses on U.S. healthcare regulatory issues, in particular coverage and reimbursement issues, especially those involving large governmental payers like the Medicare program and state Medicaid agencies. I also work extensively in the space of regenerative medicine, including developing coverage and reimbursement pathways for a variety of different CAR-Ts, TIL therapy, and several stem cell-based technologies. And what we're seeing in terms of US reimbursement is the United States is still very much forming a consensus on what reimbursement pathways work best for novel transformational regenerative medicines. As Mike mentioned at the top of this presentation, regenerative medicine implicates so many of the biggest policy questions in healthcare, both in the US and the world at large. It carries enormous, unparalleled clinical potential, but it also has significant one-time costs for the system as a whole. And US payers are really still grappling with how best to balance those competing considerations. Complicating considerations of policy are also how we can fit transformational regenerative medicines into the existing legal frameworks. And that isn't always easy. The US is somewhat unique in that, at least for the largest governmental payers, we really don't negotiate for our prices. Instead, rates get set based on complex legal and regulatory formulas and methodologies. And for many of these large payers like Medicare, the programs date to times like 1965 for the Medicare program, and the legal and regulatory methodologies really weren't designed to account for novel regenerative medicines of today. And this can very much complicate the available pathways for reimbursement, which means that there's incredible needs for creative reimbursement solutions for many of the most innovative gene and cell therapies and other regenerative medicines in order to ensure there's an adequate pathway for reimbursement for these important technologies. And next, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Ernesto.
Thank you very much, James. Hello, everyone. My name is Ernesto Algaba. I'm partner of Hogan Lovells based in Mexico City. And my practice is basically regulatory life science. We form part of a global cross-disciplinary life science working group. And I say on a regular basis, we advise a diversity of clients with a wide range of activities in the sector. That naturally includes the full regulatory advice relating to stem cells and gene therapies. These particular topics present unique challenges, but at the same time, really big opportunities in our country. Unlike some other countries, there is not a particular legal framework for stem cells and gene therapies, meaning that we need to follow the standard rules that we have in place for the development of this type of matters involving stem cells and gene therapies. The existence of big health institutions, capable doctors, low costs, and our geographic location together with a diversified and big population makes Mexico a very attractive destination for the development of these particular topics. A strength since last few years include clinical trials and medical tourism, activities, which we will further discuss under the cross-cutting issue relating to unapproved medicines in our country. Thanks.
Thank you, Ernesto and team. Now we'll move to going a little bit more in depth into 3 different issues. We'll start with clinical trials and some of the topics and issues that arise for regenerative medicines in that area. So now we'll first turn back to Australia, and Mandy will tell us a little bit about clinical trials and those issues there.
Thanks, Mike. Generally speaking, a lack of current manufacturing capabilities in Australia is presenting a bit of an issue for regenerative medicine in Australia. Notwithstanding that, there are currently 133 clinical trials that are ongoing in this space. There are only 7 facilities licensed by our regulator, the TGA, to produce regenerative medicine. And there are another 5 manufacturing sites that manufacture for early stage clinical trials where our regulator's approval is not required. The TGA, our regulator, approved Australia's first and only manufacturing site for CAR T cell therapy, which is a treatment for blood cancer, just last year in 2021. In terms of some general trends in relation to regenerative medicine clinical trials in Australia, and this some of this information is based off our clinical database, which is published by the Regenerative Medicine Consortium project. Overall, there have been approximately 222 regenerative medicine clinical trials in Australia in the last 6 years. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, 133 of those are still ongoing. Gene therapy is the most common type of regenerative medicine clinical trial in Australia, accounting for approximately 50% of trials in those past 6 years. And cell therapy accounted for roughly 31%, while gene modified cell therapy encompassed about 15%. The most common disease that regenerative medicine clinical trials are currently aiming to treat in Australia relates to cancer treatments, followed by central nervous system issues, where there are about 40 trials currently on foot. The Australian Regenerative Medicine Institute, in partnership with AstraZeneca, just last year was awarded almost $900,000 as a grant to research a particular type of immune cell that could be potentially reprogrammed to stimulate tissue regeneration, which is quite exciting. Just some other trials that we're currently watching. There's a placenta stem cell that are currently being researched to see if they can prevent brain injuries and disabilities such as cerebral palsy. And there is a cell treatment for myelofibrosis, which is a type of bone marrow cancer, which is due to start clinical trials in Australia later on this year. That involves an antibody which prevents the growth of cancerous cells. So that's just a little highlight of what's going on in Australia. So it's certainly a space that is growing. Hopefully we see a lot more growth in the space in Australia, as well as some more funding from the government, as well as from some pharmaceutical companies as well. And I'm now going to pass over to Michael.
Hi, thanks, Mandy. Okay, so interestingly, a lot of clinical trials ongoing also in Europe on a variety of treatments. And I'll say a few words about clinical trials in Europe in terms of, let's say, the regulatory constraints again. So most new regenerative medicines are classified by the European Medicines Agency as being advanced therapy medicinal products, or ATMPs. You may have heard this before. And the trials on these products, as mentioned before, these raise a variety of new issues, but as often is the case, the regulatory framework has not followed up at the right pace. And I guess it's similar to what we had by James mentioning in the US with Medicare. I mean, there's there are concerns about some regulations being outdated or not, at least not adapted to this technology. So for instance, we have a new unified EU regulatory framework for clinical trials, which came into force earlier this year after a quite long wait due to technical issues. And this should now facilitate conducting multicentric trials in Europe. But on top of that, there are further layers of regulations that need to be taken into account. And here are a few examples. So regarding human cells, for instance, human cells can be regulated as tissue or as blood, and this may actually vary between countries. And France, Germany, for instance, don't have necessarily the exact same approach. This has implications on the requirement of collection centers to be able to work under the appropriate manufacturing licenses. And you may also need to adapt your own procedures accordingly, depending on the local markets where you're running your trials. Another example are supply chains for trial products. For instance, for autologous products, data protection rules are a major piece that you need to think through for your trial. The stages from cell collection to treatment must be properly designed from a privacy standpoint due to sensitive health data being processed. And so you'll need to think about, for instance, what sort of privacy design you will adopt. Would you choose a controller to controller approach or a control to processor structure? We've been spending hours negotiating with health institutions on this very same topic. And then once you've agreed on that, you need to adapt your documentation accordingly. For allogenic products, again, as part of supply chain for trial products, companies that conduct clinical trials need to manufacture these products in compliance with the EU good clinical practices and good manufacturing practices, which contain specific requirements in relation to advanced medicinal therapies. So if you manufacture these products outside the EU, you want to run your trials in Europe, you need to ensure that your local sites outside EU comply with these requirements. And as a trial sponsor, you'll have to impose these requirements contractually to your cell collection and manufacturing sites, for instance, outside the EU. And this also means that you only have to educate your contracting partners on what actually the EU requires. Another example is, again, regulations on GMOs, which introduce disparity within Europe. If your gene therapy contains GMOs, you'll have to comply with specific procedures and filing requirements. And again, these may depend on how your GMO is classified, and you have to think about how this classification varies between countries. And this will obviously have an impact on the scrutiny that will be applied to your product by the authorities. And lastly, contracting for clinical trials may also depend on EU member states. Some countries have adopted clinical trial template agreements, some haven't. And on top of these agreements, you also need to think about additional agreements depending on the types of additional services that are required for your studies. For instance, if you require apheresis services, then you'll have to, first of all, adapt your contracts and also educate, again, healthcare institutions on these sorts of contractual framework. So we're expecting revisions on the EU regulatory framework quite soon. But in the meantime, you need to basically discuss and anticipate these in advance so that you can ensure your trials can be deployed smoothly. So I'll pass on to Lowell to discuss about the US concerns.
Thanks, Michael. There are two issues that I wanted to focus on or highlight today in terms of cross-cutting issues in clinical trials in the US. One is manufacturing consistency at early stages. And the second is considerations when using companion diagnostics. So scalability, optimizing your CMC processes from preclinical research to early stage usage and ultimately to full-scale commercialization remains critical. And what we're seeing is a greater focus on standardizing protocols at early stages, validating methods and processes that are to ultimately gear up towards tech transfer to contract manufacturers. And that process also allows for better analysis of comparability if to the extent that there are changes. As mentioned earlier, we know that manufacturing processes are critical, and especially when involving bespoke therapies, and it can create significant delays. Earlier validation of protocols for early stage productions can assist with, as mentioned, tech transfer to ensure GCP compliance and ensure comparability and equivalence. And importantly, helps innovators to avoid surprises during late stage development or even new issues that if they were to come up during the FDA review process. In addition to that, advanced manufacturing technologies, such as continuous manufacturing, can help to improve products, processes, moving from sort of the traditional batch production to continuous flow to advance drug quality, address drug shortages, and even accelerate time to market. The second area that I wanted to highlight is companion diagnostics. And so an important consideration for clinical development is whether a companion diagnostic is essential for the safe and effective use of the therapeutic. In the context of the broader context of personalized medicine, we're seeing more and more approvals each year, accounting for more than 20% of new drug approvals each year. And the success of personalized medicine really depends on valid and accurate diagnostics. So it's important to consider, again, at early stages, what are you measuring, how it's qualified, what tools are being used, and are the data ultimately, validated and can, help to facilitate drug development. There are a couple of reasons why it's so important to think about at early stages. One, the use of a companion diagnostic is stipulated in instructions for the use in the labeling of both the companion diagnostic and the corresponding therapeutic. Second, also, market access really depends on a successful development strategy when it includes a companion diagnostic. So thinking about your development strategy, whether it is in co-development, collaboration, or partnership, and also thinking about scale-up considerations as you're moving from early stage and gearing up towards more sort of commercial stages, because discovery often leads to use of a laboratory developed test regulated by clear regulations in CMS. And then when there's established proof of concept, there are plans to then scale up to companion diagnostic at later stages. So important to consider what studies, if any, are needed to show same performance and reliability. And lastly, just there are changes looming as always, as my colleagues have mentioned, in their jurisdictions to keep a close eye on, especially here in the U.S. With user fee legislation progresses and proposed legislation that could help clarify FDA's authority with respect to diagnostics, which could generate and lead to additional regulations and guidance. So an area that we here in the U.S. are watching especially closely.
Thank you so much, Lowell. Now we're going to switch to another cross-cutting issue, reimbursement and payment. Many of these products are one-time curative therapies. They are expensive to make, and they pose some very interesting but difficult challenges for the reimbursement framework in various countries. So we'll turn now to France, to Charlotte, to explain in a little bit more depth some of the issues facing of reimbursement in France.
Thank you, Michael. I'm glad to start this pricing cutting edge topic. So in France, there was a clear initial willingness of the French government to favor the gene therapies with a rapid market access, with the example of Germany, which is clearly an example in Europe of rapid market access. The first gene therapies for spinal muscular atrophy, leukemia, and lymphoma have been welcomed in France with very high prices that have been at the heart of the press release as a hot topic. But the problem of financing these products has come out very rapidly. And now we are seeing in France that gene therapies face different issues. For example, a scientific assessment that has become stricter with the requirement of the French health authorities of comparative data and the rejection of indirect data. We have seen, because of that, recent unfavorable opinion from the health technology body, including for CAR-Ts. Second, the gene therapies also face difficulties in providing real-world evidence, despite still here as a willingness of the authorities to have real-world evidence. And another issue is to negotiate outcome-based pricing agreements. There is a clear willingness of the French authorities to have sophisticated pricing agreement, but in practice, it's more difficult. We have seen also a clear pressure of the French government on prices. The authorities have been asking for price cuts, including significant clawbacks, for example, for CAR-Ts, to increase the net price pressure also. And last but not least, the French government recently introduced the possibility for French hospitals to manufacture their own gene therapies. In conclusion, so the gene therapies are facing difficulties in accessing the market, especially because of price issue. So what we are doing at Hogan Lovells Paris, we are working with the client to negotiate the financing of these gene therapies on a macroeconomic level, for example, in proposing reform to the French government, in discussing new law, etc., and proposing solutions to finance them. And we're also working with pharma companies individually to prepare for their health technology assessment, pricing and reimbursement conditions for these innovative products. So the conclusion that in France, there was clearly a will of the government to promote the gene therapies as innovative products, part of the plan of Emmanuel Macron for innovative products, but in practice, it is not so simple because of a financing issue, and we are finding solutions for that.
Thank you, Charlotte. Now we'll turn to the United States and hear from James on how things measure up there.
Thanks, Mike. I mean, in terms of how regenerative medicines get paid, from a US perspective, the short answer really is it's complicated. The US is a patchwork of different payment systems in the best of times, because rather than having a single governmental payer, we have countless different payers ranging from governmental entities to private health insurance companies. And transformational medicines really are challenging virtually all of those different payers and payment systems. What we have seen over the past several years, though, is the beginnings of creative reimbursement pathways targeting at least some of the first novel regenerative medicines. And in many ways, as it often does, the Medicare agency, the US's largest payer, has led the way on creative thinking. So, for example, in 2020, we saw Medicare develop a special payment pathway for the CAR-T cell therapies, including a special inpatient hospital payment bundle that at the time, and as it continues to be, is the highest paying in all of Medicare. That said, that's really only the opening foray with respect to reimbursement of regenerative medicines, especially transformative regenerative medicines. Numerous open questions and challenges remain, and there are especially open questions with respect to how the next generation of non-CAR-T gene and cell therapies may be covered and paid by Medicare and other payers in the US, especially given that they may not share the same characteristics of CAR-Ts from a clinical or cost perspective. And because of how the US legal framework works, those specific characteristics and details about therapies, they can very significantly impact reimbursement. So for example, even things like the site of service, whether it's an inpatient hospital or outpatient hospital or physician office services, that has enormous reimbursement ramifications in various different payment systems. Similarly, how different payers will classify your product, is it biologic, is it a transplant procedure, that can also matter a great deal. And you'll see that, some of the stem cell technologies, they may straddle the line. It may not be clear, at least from a payer's perspective, whether it should be best classified for reimbursement purposes as a biologic or as a transplant procedure, because it doesn't always exactly track to FDA's classifications. In other words, based on how a given regenerative medicine is regulated and where it will be furnished and how different payers will classify it, you can see very, very different reimbursement implications. And that's part of why early engagement on issues of reimbursement is so incredibly important. It's important to think about these types of issues early on pre-approval, when there's still opportunity to influence these factors through things like how you structure your clinical trial. Ultimately, because the US reimbursement policies are still evolving in this space, there's also great opportunity to shape the policies that could be applicable to regenerative medicine, because we really are still charting the course. And next, I'll turn it over to Lu Zhou to talk about reimbursement in China.
Thanks, James. Well, China has a public health insurance system that is available to vast majority of the Chinese population. This is how Chinese get the drugs medical treatment reimbursed for most of the time. There are private healthcare insurance available as well, but only small population manage to get one due to the cost reason. So for drugs and treatments that are being reimbursed by the public health insurance, such drugs treatments need to be ordered from the national reimbursement drug list through the public hospitals. Drug companies are competing to get into this drug list, or by all means, so as to get the access to the Chinese population. The regulators typically will ask the drug manufacturer to give a discount up to 50% on the price of their products when they negotiate the entrance into this drug list. To our knowledge, so far there are only 2 domestic CAR T cell therapy products have been approved to be marketed in China, but they have not been included in the drug list. That means usage of CAR T cell therapy products in China at this stage cannot be reimbursed through the public health insurance system and need to be paid out of the patient's own pocket or get the private insurance to cover this cost. One thing also worth to mention is that Chinese government is additionally implementing the centralized bidding process and the volume-based procurement for drug products, which are aimed to achieve significant reduction in drug price. So the eligible bidders for this procurement, both the domestic marketing authorization holders and the exclusive distributors on behalf of the foreign marketing authorization holders, can participate in this procurement. However, drugs that are not included in this drug list typically are very likely to be excluded in the volume-based procurement. We have seen that the manufacturer of cell therapy products have done some efforts in this regard. The first approved CAR T cell therapy product in China, Yescarta of Fosun Kite, has passed the initial review in the 2021 medical insurance reimbursement program negotiation, but it was later excluded from the subsequent negotiation process. We believe this is associated with the high price of cell therapy product. Therefore, whether to get into the public system will require the drug companies to consider how to balance between the lower profit margin and the potential increase of the total profits arising from the large volume of the demands.
Thank you so much, Lou. Really interesting. So now we'll move to our last topic, which is unapproved medicines. As you heard, the approval for these innovative and sometimes very costly products is challenging in many times and moving at a slower pace than many would hope, particularly the patients who are in desperate need for them. And so as a result, there have been various mechanisms for getting these products to patients. In the United States, there's at least for some of the minimally manipulated products, there's a framework for bringing them to market without approval, but it's very limited. And there's been some recent discussions about trying to open it up to products that don't quite qualify. And you'll hear in a couple other jurisdictions about how things stand there. So now we'll turn back to China. We'll hear from Carol Chow about that topic there. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Mike. And under the PRC law, in addition to certain limited R&D and clinical trial purpose, typically the important drugs are not allowed to enter the Chinese market until they have been approved by the PRC authority we call the NMPA. However, as an exception, the Chinese regulators have provided a special pathway for such unauthorized drug to be imported and marketed in Boao Medical Pillow Zone in Hainan province since 2019. And specifically, the unregistered imported drugs only with home country approval, but no NMPA approval in urgent clinical needs by medical institutions in Blau. And under the condition of no similar drug already approved in China are permitted to be imported with a special importation approval from the local Health Commission and local NMPA for use in the designated medical institutions in Blau for their medical purpose. And typically, such special importation approval needs to be applied by the medical institutions in Blau. But we understand that in practice, such approval can be initiated by a physician, a patient, or a foreign manufacturer as well. And anyway, the local NMPA, then the local health commission will do an evaluation on the product safety of the drug and whether the drugs are in urgent clinical need and whether the medical institutions has the ability of using such drugs. And the timeline of obtaining such special importation approval is very fast. Typically, the approval will be obtained within 3 business days after the submission date. And applying for the special approval in Blau will be beneficial to obtain the normal marketing authorization at the national level in China. The clinical data generated by such drugs during their use in Blau can be further used to support the subsequent normal path of drug registrations within the NMPA. Also, the foreign manufacturer of such drugs can apply for the research pilot of real-world evidence in Blau with the authorities in order to generate the data, which could then turn into real-world evidence to the benefit of subsequent product registration within NMPA. And so far, we cited that a drug with special importation approval has already successfully obtained the conditional marketing authorization approval from the NMPA in 2021 through the pathway we mentioned about. And typically using real-world evidence for market authorization application will shorten the registration timeline in China, but this will vary on case by case because there is no mandatory timeline on this. And this is my part. I will pass on to Ernesto. Thank you.
Hello, Lou. Thanks, Carol. Well, yes, in terms of unapproved medicines in Mexico, such as in any other country, only authorized drugs that have been prior approved by the Mexican regulator could be used and imported in Mexico. So this has turned to be in several alternatives for the development and using of this type of products. Basically, the development has been achieved through the performance of clinical trials, both performed at public and private institutions. There are certain particularities under Mexican law that need to be considered with respect to the running of clinical trials in terms of liability. All the rules that govern the performance of clinical trials, it does not limit or does not allow to limit the responsibility of sponsors. So care shall be given on how, even though there's an express restriction for the not limiting that responsibility of sponsors, there are some specific ways and pathways under which sponsors have been able to limit the responsibility with institutions and principal investigators. Another important issue that needs to be considered is whether the relevant product is considered as a biologic product, or rather will be only considered as a matter of considered as transplants. So these are the type of challenges that need to be tackled with the authority, and as well at the time, all the relevant agreements and the paperwork, including the informed consents, including the data privacy notices, need to be considered for the naturally achieving a proper conduction of a clinical trial that is attractive not only for the sponsor, but as well for the institution and as well for the public, for the government. As well, there has been, the medical tourism has been a phenomenon a phenomenon that has been proliferated importantly, not only with respect to standard medicine services, medical services, but as well with respect to activities involving stem cells, even where there may not be sufficient support concerning its efficacy or safety. So this has turned to be, I mean, the way in which our rules are set forth, which are permissive ones, have allowed to the setting up of a lot of companies, basically on the northern part of the country, for the rendering that are aimed and they advocated for the rendering of medical services, including stem cells and the gene therapies. So we can say that the most important issues for properly tackling all these matters is to first identify what would be the core of the activity, whether it would be authorized or not by the relevant authority. It's important to understand what are the challenges given for securing the relevant approvals, given the poor or lack of scientific specialization of our authorities. And as well, we need to make sure that full compliance is given with respect to all the activities concerning the rendering of medical services and as well for the performance of trials. So an integral overview of all these matters will allow to perform adequately all medical services involving stem cells and gene therapies. Thanks.
Thank you, Ernesto, and thank you, team. I hope everyone found this session enlightening. I hope it raised issues that are important to consider when developing these products. And I encourage and invite you to reach out to all of my colleagues to learn more and to explore ways in which we can help, Hogan Lovells can help you advance this really important field. So I want to thank the Regenerative Medicine Foundation, the Wake Forest Institute of Regenerative Medicine, and Bernie Siegel for this opportunity. And we look forward to collaborating with all of you and connecting with as many of you as possible during the conference. We hope to have some individual sessions, so please feel free to reach out to any and all of us to schedule them. And we look forward to seeing you going forward.